Stephanie Kleiderman is she's completed her PhD. She is currently working in conservation psychology as a researcher and a wildlife photographer based in South Africa. Her work has focused primarily on envisioning a conservation psychology that is relevant in the South African context, with a stronger focus on justice and systemic issues as opposed to behavior and attitude change. She specializes in qualitative research methodologies and photographic storytelling using photo voice. Her other areas of interest include program evaluation, capacity development, conservation and wildlife photography as a narrative tool, and environmental education for teenagers and young adults. Stephanie is also the campaign coordinator for Blood Lions, Youth for Lions, and a member of the Climate, Environmental, and Psychology Special Interest Group of the Psychological Society of South Africa. So, I don't know if you know who I am. My name's Fatima Peters. I am, um, we are both on the executive for the Climate and Environmental Psychology Special Interest Group. So if you get emails from me, I'm not a hacker. I know sometimes people, I was like, why is Fatima emailing me? And I get people coming up to me like, I get your emails. Thank you so much. And I'm like, I don't know who you are, but I appreciate the thank you. So, yes, I'm the person that emails you and organizes the things in the background. So, welcome, everybody. We are excited to be engaging with you. And I hand it over to our amazing presenter. Good luck and enjoy. And I'm going to switch off my microphone and camera so that I don't distract you.
Thank you so much, Fatima. I am quickly going to just open up here and just move to full screen. All right, can everyone see the screen clearly? It's showing up. Fatima, I just want to check it's presenting properly.
It looks beautiful. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, we have thumbs up emojis. So thank you for that, everybody. We appreciate the emojis.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I can't see anything when I'm in full screen. So if anything goes wrong, just give me a shout and I will try fix it. And then when I exit the full screen, then I should be able to see the reactions and that type of thing afterwards.
That sounds good.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us with our first Climate, Environment and Psychology webinar in the series. We really look forward to being able to share more opportunities and discuss psychology's contributions to environmental work. As Fatima says, I am Stephanie Kleiderman and I'm a researcher, educator and photographer. And today we're going to be having a discussion about conservation psychology, a little bit of a high-level overview of what it is, and specifically looking at it in the South African context. So this is just a brief outline of what we'll be covering today. Like I said, it's very much a high-level introduction to conservation psychology, its relevance and importance, and also having a look at its role in the South African context. Now, I really love this quote because I think it sums up the really diverse and complex field that is conservation psychology. And it's a field of research, but also in practice as well. And this is initially what drew me to the field, was this really explicit or expressed relationship or connection that we have with nature, as opposed to the dichotomy that we so typically see when thinking about people and the natural environment, and this idea that we are separate in some way. And so this quote really summarizes quite nicely what conservation psychology stands for. So I first wanted to start out by having a look at why conservation psychology. And we know it's already well established that conservation is primarily driven by really significant human dimensions. And so a lot like conservation biology, which is very mission driven and focused on halting the loss of biodiversity, conservation psychology could also be seen to be mission driven and primarily towards the idea of protecting the natural environment and promoting our relationship with it. Now, Sewell said in 1986 already that the conservation sciences are really dependent upon the social sciences. And this really reflects an early recognition that there is a significant contribution that the social sciences can make to conservation. But historically speaking, it hasn't received as much recognition for the potential contributions that it can make. Now, for conservation to be effective, it's really necessary to understand the more complex and multifaceted nature of human behavior, attitudes, decision-making, and social norms in relation to the environment. Now, despite the fact that social sciences have yet to become really well established and recognized in the field of conservation, it is becoming increasingly acknowledged. So the social sciences can really provide some valuable insight into understanding conservation on multiple levels. So we can understand it on an individual level, a local or regional level, and of course on a global scale. Now, Hicks et al. In 2016 also devised a number of social indicators where they believe the social sciences can contribute value to conservation. According to Hicks, they say here that assessing well-being is one of the more important ones because really we need to understand well-being outside of purely economic interests, and also understanding that there is material and relational well-being and quality of life that involves the environment. Sorry, give me one moment. The cat has decided to move. There we go. So in addition to well-being being a social indicator, also understanding and appreciating human values linked to this well-being is really necessary to understand what drives human behavior and thinking. Thirdly, they believed in agency and empowerment being social indicators necessary to understand what people pursue in terms of what they value and what is required to be able to improve human well-being. And then lastly, inequality is also an important social indicator because it provides critical insight into how sustainability can be negatively impacted by unequal access in terms of resources and power. There is also a really urgent need for research to prioritize non-Western communities, really to broaden scientific knowledge and also to show a greater appreciation for Indigenous knowledge systems and incorporating these into mainstream conservation. So why is any of this important? Now we can take a closer look at that. Recently, a really important driver of environmental concerns was the COVID-19 pandemic, during which environmental issues gained significant attention and momentum. For many, the pandemic forced us to reevaluate our relationships with the natural world and our exploitation of it based on the evidence that the COVID-19 pandemic originated in a wet market. Now, these markets are typically characterized by extremely unhygienic and stressful conditions for the animals that are kept there and for the people that consume these animals afterwards. Now, these animals are usually brought in primarily through illegal channels and are then slaughtered in really unsanitary conditions. And the COVID-19 pandemic was also not the first of its kind. It wasn't the first pandemic or epidemic with zoonotic origins. It's also really important to note that biodiversity is an all-inclusive term that refers to all elements of the environment vital to our health and survival. And this includes air quality, water, food security, climate, medicinal value, well-being physically and mentally, as well as the economy and disease. The Human Rights Council summed it up in the following quote, saying, "The resulting loss of biodiversity and the decline in services provided by ecosystems interfere with the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and that environmental damage has negative implications, both direct and indirect, for the effective enjoyment of all human rights." And I really believe that this sums up why it's so important for us to take a closer look at how we can create a more collaborative way of understanding conservation of biodiversity, because really it is so interconnected as well with human well-being. So now that we've established why this field of research and practice is gaining recognition for its potential contributions, we can also take a closer look at the field, which was co-founded by Carol Sanders in the early 2000s, which makes it a relatively recent field of psychology. Now, initially, it was primarily American in its roots, and it was actually developed more so in a zoo environment and has since expanded further. This was also one of the many reasons why I felt it was necessary to reconceptualize conservation psychology more so from a South African perspective in order to broaden its applicability in more environments. So according to the APA, conservation psychology really shows a recognition that there is a reciprocal relationship that exists between human behavior and the natural environment. And it falls under the larger umbrella of environmental psychology, which incorporates everything from urban and natural spaces, the conservation of wildlife and wild spaces, environmental health and the environment, as well as population densities. Now, the research that I've conducted so far on conservation psychology has primarily concerned natural spaces and conservation, and then also bringing in the element of engaging with communities living in these areas. So according to the APA, conservation psychology is primarily focused on creating an environmental ethic and collective behavior change. And this really also makes it a multidisciplinary field in which it is both applied and theoretical in nature. And so it engages or collaborates with other fields, including the conservation sciences and other social sciences too. And in so doing, it really appreciates the interrelated and reciprocal nature of the relationship that exists between humans and the natural environment. Now, taking a closer look at the South African context, there has been increased attention towards issues of justice and climate change in South Africa and, of course, globally. But current conceptualizations of conservation and conservation psychology are primarily based on more Western thinking. And as a result of this, it does not really address injustice explicitly. From a South African perspective, during apartheid, land dispossession caused extreme exclusion and a lack of access to land and resources as a result. And this legacy still continues to this day. Therefore, focusing on individual behavior change and individual agency alone is not likely to be successful or even relevant in a South African context. And so this really promotes the idea that we need to prioritize dismantling and critically examining the more historical and contemporary injustices and structural racism that we still see in conservation practice to this day. Now, environmental justice gained recognition and attention in the 1960s, primarily for Black garbage workers who were working in incredibly unsanitary and unjust conditions. This resulted in numerous protests against the more disproportionate impact of environmental damages experienced by historically disadvantaged communities. And as a result, the term environmental racism also gained recognition. And this really refers to the unjust burden of environmental damages and discrimination perpetuated against specific racial groups. Environmental justice also can provide a really valuable bridge to address both the social and ecological injustices, particularly by looking and examining issues of empowerment, grassroots initiatives, and a critical examination and dismantling of racist practices. In South Africa, this is incredibly relevant when we consider our colonial past, which so entrenched institutional racism and exploitation. Our conservation practices, unfortunately, are also reflective of this kind of racism and exclusion, which was perpetuated or created under apartheid. During the apartheid years, we saw forced removals, prohibited use of natural resources, and severe punishment for trespassing on land that was closed off or protected. Now, in present-day conservation, this needs to be explicitly addressed, and these inequalities need to be addressed. Even though they were entrenched during apartheid, its legacy still continues to this day. And this is one of the big reasons why my research focused so much on the racial and social inequality, which we often see happening in conservation work, both in South Africa and, of course, more globally. It's also necessary for researchers to explore this in more depth, primarily to be able to understand how this would look in practice, so that conservation initiatives can learn how to address injustice through their work, as opposed to inadvertently perpetuating it. Now, looking at psychology more specifically, I want to take a closer look at fortress conservation. Now, this is a type of conservation which we have typically seen in South Africa. We see fences, huge amounts of security, anti-poaching efforts, all of which have been used in the name of conserving the resources, the wildlife, etc. on the inside. And we see this happening since apartheid years in South African natural or protected spaces. But unfortunately, this fortress conservation has also perpetuated injustice through exclusion and really severe punishments for any trespassing. Unfortunately, as well, this could also result in ineffective protection and a further violation of human well-being and equality. Now, in contrast to this, psychology tends to have a much stronger focus on issues of process, consultation, and inclusion, and therefore can be really valuable in the design, implementation, and assessment of conservation initiatives. It can also provide really valuable insight into policy and practice from an individual scale to a local and even an international scale. And this is where psychology can really contribute to the more human component of conservation that needs to be recognized to prevent social and environmental injustices being perpetuated. In my PhD work, I conducted a case study on a capacity building outreach that's located in the Greater Kruger region in the area of Bushbuck Ridge. And this was primarily aimed at youth from a historically marginalized community. Now, from a historical standpoint, this community is really important because they were some of the first to be excluded, marginalized, forcefully removed off of their land in the name of creating protected spaces. And so the Bushbuck Ridge community is really, really important because it shows this dichotomy that happened where people were excluded from these protected spaces in really violent and unjust ways. So the outreach uses photography as a vehicle for environmental education, capacity building, and improving the representation of Black youth, both in the photographic profession, but also in conservation spaces. In order to study this, I used the theory of engagement to frame this capacity building initiative in terms of their activities and their outcomes, and to better understand how they achieve their goals. I also used photo voice to explore the experiences of these young participants. And so what we did is we devised environmental themes, and the participants all contributed their own photographs and their own stories that really encapsulated their experiences. Now, the issues that arose in these findings include a continuing sense of exclusion from natural spaces. And also, quite shockingly, the idea that conservation is primarily in the realm of white people, that it's something that white people handle or white people engage in, and that Black people living on the borders of these areas are actually unwelcome and excluded from any activities that happen on the other side. There was also a serious concern for the lack of representation of Black youth in conservation work and spaces. On the other hand, we also saw that the outreach provided an ideal foundation to counter this legacy of exclusion. And this was really achieved because of its goals of building capacity and empowering young people beyond just what was happening in the outreach to be able to seek work, seek employment, study further, engage in activities where beforehand, most of these youth felt that they didn't have a place. They weren't represented in these spaces. It was also interesting to find that photography was not only a really enjoyable hobby, but it had also become a career path. And this has also acted as a greater means of representation and inclusion of Black youth in conservation, wild spaces, and the larger photographic profession. From my research, there's also a number of possible future directions that conservation psychology could take, specifically in the South African context. And this is really just a brief outline of the kinds of areas of research that could be approached in order to really understand how conservation psychology could be more applicable, appropriate, and relevant in a South African context. So place and attachment, community-specific research and engagement specifically related to biodiversity conservation, historical marginalization and exclusion. Also incorporating Indigenous knowledge systems into mainstream conservation, relationships with nature in both urban and rural environments, environmental education and conservation messaging are all potential areas where this field could develop, really to become appropriate in a South African context, and of course an even larger African context, in order to broaden what has primarily been a very Western field of research and practice up to this point. Next, I've also included some very preliminary and very short reading that could be useful to anyone who wants to explore this area. If you are interested in further reading, please don't hesitate to get in touch, because of course there is so much more beyond this. But I thought that these were some of the really important things that would be of interest to anybody looking to pursue this field. And I'd be willing to provide a reading list, a much longer one, to anyone who would be interested in that. And that is all from my side. I'd be happy to take on any questions, any queries from those in the audience.
So thank you so much for that really informative and lovely presentation. I really love the way you explained how the historical legacy has contributed to where we are currently with regard to conservation psychology. And I think you make some really valid and important points about having more people included in the conservation area. It's interesting how even though after 30 years of um, democracy, people still feel an inability to engage with the natural environment. And just yesterday, or this morning, I was saying to my husband, we're using borehole water and my eczema on my hands is like really bad. And I was thinking about your presentation and I'm like, the environment really is impacting on me. And a person would think, sorry, I have a bit of a chest infection. You would think that environment is something that it's the climate, it's the weather. And I really like how you brought the direct impact of the environment to us as people. And I think that is something for us as a group and also for the broader community for climate and environmental psychology to actually be engaging with, because I think more awareness around this does need to be made. So it's 12:30 now. We would like to open up the floor if there are any questions or comments, or people who would like to say anything. We'd like to open up the floor to have you. You can put your questions in the chat box if you feel you don't want to speak in front of the audience that is here. We're quite a small and intimate group, so there's no need to feel shy. There's no judgment here. It's a safe space. I learned a lot. I'm a PhD student as well. So I think that if you would like to ask anything, please go ahead. If you would like to make a comment in the chat box, you can do so too. If you would like to send some heart emojis, you can go ahead and do that as well. I see there is a hand. Get it. You may go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Dr. Klaumann, and also Fatima for organizing this great presentation. Stephanie, I'd be really interested to just hear your perspective of what do you see as the future of conservation psychology in South Africa, and you really are spending a lot of time on this topic and really, you know, probably out of those that I know, thinking the most through this. And what do you see as kind of the direction that's needed? And yeah, I'd be interested kind of institutionally or even research-wise or whatever, what you think the future would, what a good future would be for conservation psychology in South Africa.
I think that's such a complex question, but really one of the directions I would like to explore more would also be the idea of promoting coexistence. I think because I live in a very urban environment and I feel very far away from what we would normally associate with these natural spaces, I'm so interested to explore that idea of coexistence in multiple environments. But with that being said, there's also a lot happening within government at the moment. And if we look at the Department of Environmental Affairs at the moment, they've released a white paper that was originally entitled the New Deal for it was wildlife and people, or nature and people. And I think this was really, really important because the New Deal was essentially laying out a plan that would promote a healthy coexistence and a healthy appreciation for all of the benefits that we gain from the environment. So it was really about moving away from exploitation and usage only for gain. And so I'm quite excited to see how this New Deal is going to work and how we can see this put into legislation. Of course, this is going to be a slow process and nothing would necessarily happen quickly as far as legislation goes. But if you're interested in more legislation space, I would definitely take a look at the New Deal and just have a look at what the white paper is suggesting. And I think it's promoting a far more harmonious kind of relationship, but it's also taking a focus on justice and trying to move away from the idea of exclusion and conservation being this very kind of siloed space where communities are left out. And we need to be looking more so at how people can benefit from resources and natural spaces, not just in terms of its economic use, but also its more relational value. Thanks, Gareth. That was a really great question. I also see that Nick Wood has asked a question.
So if I can read it to you, it says, lovely presentation. Thanks, Stephanie. How do we foster indigenous centering of conservation movement as regional custodians and land protectors? In Kenya, some forces operating profit over people and planet. So he's put a link in there for us. So what's your thoughts on the question?
I've been watching that quite closely as well, the issue in Kenya and in Tanzania as well. As far as a more indigenous centering goes, I really do believe that is incredibly deserving of more attention. I have seen, if you look at the Sandparks website, that they're actually promoting the idea of more indigenous knowledge being recorded, which I think is a fantastic project to get involved in. It has to, I think it comes back to the New Deal as well in the white paper. I really feel that if we're going to achieve those goals, we would need to prioritize indigenous knowledge systems. We'd need to be able to prioritize the idea that conservation science as it stands is primarily Western, and we need to start looking to African-centered knowledge as well to incorporate that into mainstream conservation, to make it more inclusive and to make it more diverse.
Thanks. Nick Wood says, thanks, Stephanie. Yes, he's really, Tanzania is moving in the right direction. So we have a hand up. Alexandra Howard, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Fatima. Thanks, Steph. A great presentation, as always. I'm glad I finally got to see it from a different perspective. I guess I'm cheating because I know Steph and I know what she does. But I think maybe my question is, ideally, how would you imagine Kruger, for example, sandparks to be more inclusive and just? So, for example, recently I was quite upset because they now have a rule that there's no cash allowed. And living next to Golden Gate, I feel that's very unfair because you can't expect all South Africans to pay by card. Or I feel like it's a small thing, but it has a huge knock-on effect.
I think small actions like that really speak volumes about not considering the wider South African population. And that is a really sad thing to hear, that they're going to be implementing that. From the perspective of the Kruger, I did have a closer look at some of their environmental initiatives, their educational initiatives, and I think these are fantastic. But one of the things that worried me so much about their environmental education initiatives is that they're so short. So, for example, they might bring in around 100 children, but they would only stay for 1 to 3 hours. So these kinds of interactions with the environment are so short-lived. I don't feel like they're allowing for a more meaningful connection to be made. And conservation fees, these types of things are incredibly expensive. You know, having a car, having petrol, the money to buy meals, now a credit card because you can't bring cash. Those types of things are really excluding a large portion of people who live on the boundaries of that park, but still don't feel like they can gain access to it. And this is where outreaches like Wild Shots have done such incredible work, where it's part and parcel of what they do. And it goes beyond the outreach activities. It's not about taking a single game drive into the park. It's rather about creating opportunities, ongoing opportunities, even professional opportunities, where youngsters can access the park because it's part and parcel of their job now, or they want to take their family along and now they have the resources to do so. So I feel like we need to be expanding on those environmental initiatives to be not just once-off activities, but to really, really contribute on a larger scale. And I feel like what I'm about to say is probably fairly controversial, but I often watch some of the Facebook groups on the Kruger National Park to see what reactions are typically like. And there was a fairly disturbing post a while back in which somebody actually asked, should we not be taking more children into the Kruger National Park, especially those from the community surrounding it? There were a fairly, decent number of responses that said, yes, absolutely, we should be including children. Most disturbingly, though, there were people who were happy to put their name to responses that said, no, why? No, that we don't need to. Or some people who would say a simple no, and I refuse to elaborate, I think was one of the comments. And it was such blatant racism that they essentially felt that the children along these boundaries were undeserving of access, and that the person promoting the idea of bringing children in and showing them a park which historically they'd been excluded from was outright met with disapproval. And I think that attitude is something that needs to be addressed so quickly. I'm not sure how, because I must say I've never really thought much about attitude change and that type of thing, but it is still worrying me to see that there are attitudes like that and that they're so explicit in social media spaces.
The one thing about social media is that people think that anonymity allows them to say whatever they want. So the ability to moderate their thoughts online is something that it really can be astounding. It's people, I don't know. I don't think people realize that their names are attached to those posts. It's like beyond me. But it's also, like you said, it's interesting to see the types of things that people actually do say. So I also think that I really like that you are bringing awareness to the fact that people that live along the natural spaces actually are deserving of being in those spaces. And I just think as you were speaking, it reminded me of as a child, I grew up in the Western Cape and I got an opportunity to go to the it's a conservation area next to UWC. And we went in there and they showed us fynbos, and I'm like, okay, this is what I see every day, what you're on about. But the impact it has on a child to see these things and to have somebody explain this fynbos is actually quite important. It's the only place in the Western Cape that you would find this. So to have children engage with these natural spaces and make it more available is something I think you have a point. We do need to have more children in wildlife spaces to also allow people to say you have a right to be here if we want to change the way in which conservation psychology is perceived. So yeah, very interesting. I think that there's quite a lot of work that we do need to do. And as just a shout out to everyone, as the climate and environmental psychology group, we are open to people who are interested in doing presentations or webinars, short podcasts on climate and environmental psychology related topics. So I'm going to put my email address into the chat box. So if you would like to reach out to me, you can do so. Sorry, my computer's acting weird. I don't know what my computer is doing. Okay, there we go. So I'm gonna just pop my email fatima.peters@uniben.ac.za. That's my work email, and I'm going to pop my private email into the chat box as well. Gmail. Okay, so those are my two email addresses. So if you would like to reach out to myself, Stephanie, or anyone else in the executive for the climate environmental psychology group, you are welcome to do so. Yeah. So Sherlock has a question. Wait, let me just scroll up a little bit. So Nick Wood says lots of disrupting whiteness still needed decades after apartheid. So nice example, Fatima, of engaging local children. And then Charlotte says, hi Stephanie, how much of this attitude influences policy development? So, there's a quite racist undertone to a lot of things that happens in our country, being South Africa. So what do you think is how do you think Charlotte's asking how much of this attitude influences policy development? So what's your thought on that?
I do think it's changing. I think probably the primary issue here is that conservation has been informed a lot by the old apartheid ways of conserving protected land. So if we look at places like the Sabi Sands or the Kruger National Park, they were created under apartheid legislation. And so that legislation did roll over and there wasn't enough reform completed when we moved into democracy. But I do think it's changing. And even though we see these attitudes happening on social media and it's acceptable to say these things, I do think on a policy level, it is starting to change. And we see that happening in the Kruger Park with the Sand Parks Board changing to be a lot more diverse, a lot more inclusive. I think the problem with policy, though, is that it takes time to change. And that's what we need to continuously keep the pressure up. We always have to make sure that policy makers and decision makers know that we want change. And that's one of the reasons why I think conservation psychology, taking a more environmental justice focus, would be really valuable in South Africa, so that policymakers see that this kind of transformation is valuable and is possible, and we can provide those new perspectives or fresh ways of thinking.
Thank you so much for that contribution, Steve. Let's see. Okay, Charlotte was saying earlier that she agrees with you about the posts that are put on social media and the things that people do say. And Alexandra says, thanks, Steph. Definitely agree that many NGOs or environmental education initiatives can improve with your ideas. So, yeah, that's what we have in the chat box so far. Prof. Bond says, lovely presentation and definitely an exciting field. So thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
So yes. Right. So I think we can talk about conservation psychology all day. It's really one of those things that I think you don't really realize how it impacts on you until you're actually engaging and talking and thinking through it. Also in a reflection, I think maybe because of the way conservation psychology is theorized and its history from being mostly international, I think that from my engagement in Limpopo with people, I think that people have a very close engagement with nature, and things like growing trees and just growing trees is like, I asked students about the history of the community, and they would say no, the chief that ruled Venda was told everybody you must grow a tree. And I'm like, to have somebody in leadership say to a community, you must grow a tree, and one of those trees should be a fruit tree. It really speaks to the importance of growing things in the community where I'm currently living. And I think, as Charlotte is saying, how much of the policy is changing, because I think the research you're doing is so important because it shows that a lot of people's voices are actually being excluded. And the closeness people feel to nature and the environment actually is is more evident when you're actually engaging in with people close to the natural resources. So yeah, I think your work is really important. You must come visit me here in Limpopo so we can go and visit the Kruger together. It will be lovely. Yes, so I don't see any more questions. If there's anyone else that would like to ask any questions or make any comments, we would love to hear from you. Yeah.
I think I might also add my email into the chat, just in case anybody would like further reading. You're welcome to get hold of me, and I'd happily pass on some resources your way.
Thank you so much for that. Garrett, your hand is up.
Stephanie, something that I was thinking about that I came across in Limpopo, for instance, is the sacred natural sites, places that are like Lake Fundutsi, for instance, that's a conservation site, biosphere reserve, I think is the term. And yeah, just wondering as well, like at the moment with the conservation discourse, we did a look at heritage sites, and most of these heritage sites are bridges, churches and stuff like basically that were nominated under the apartheid regime. And yeah, just wondering as well, it maybe goes back a bit to what Nick Woods also brought up, but there's something there about kind of, I don't know if this is the right term, but like nation building, thinking about conservation is also a part of like this nation building process and identity and stuff. Because there are so many across South Africa, these very important places to identity and stuff. And what's being done? And yeah, do you know anything about it, and how's this kind of coming across in the discourse of conservation?
I think two really important examples of that would be Mapungubwe National Park. They have definitely done an excellent job of promoting really just trying to promote local culture in the park. And if you take a look, there's a lovely museum in the park where you can actually go learn a lot more about the artifacts and the culture and the history of that area, and a beautiful, beautiful walk conducted by one of the local guides up the hill. I've forgotten the name of it, unfortunately, off the top of my head now. But Mapungubwe is a lovely example. And there's also been a lot of work done in the Kgalagadi Transfrontier Park as well. And they've recently also opened up an interpretation center to honor the local communities in that region, which is beautiful. I think it's only a couple of months old, if I remember correctly, and really does a stunning job of promoting the San culture and talking a lot about the history. And what was interesting to me in the interpretation center is that they focus a lot on the exclusion and the violence that happened in that region, and trying to honor those communities. So definitely take a look at Mapungubwe and Kgalagadi for examples of where our national parks are starting to take a turn towards that idea of, I suppose, not nation building, but definitely a promotion of our South African cultures. And I think it's a really important turn that they're taking. And I'd love to see that coming up in more protected spaces, and trying to create that feeling of inclusion, that this isn't just for the tourists. You know, this is really a celebration of the people who live there as well. Thanks, Garrett.
I think you make a very important point there about having more people speak about the natural heritage sites. I know in the Western Cape, they speak about District 6 very often, and they speak about what is called the Kramats. It's a place where people that are of historical significance are buried, and then there are people that visit these particular sites. And in the Western Cape, I think historically people always speak about District 6. But I think in places like Limpopo and other parts of the country where people have been dispossessed, I think people haven't had that opportunity to voice out the importance of the natural heritage sites and the people who were important to the culture and history of the community. So I think that you mentioned some really lovely examples, but I think more needs to be done to have communities celebrate those natural heritage sites and also natural environmental sites such as the lake, so that more awareness around this can be made. Right, so it's 10 to 1. I think that we have had a really lovely engagement. I'm really happy with the way in which we were able to complete the tasks for today. So congratulations, Stephanie, for being our very first presenter on the CEP webinars. We really hope to have many more webinars and much more detailed engagement, and have presenters from across South Africa and also internationally speak about the things that would bring more awareness to climate and environmental psychology. So I think I'm happy to conclude today. If there are no questions, Steph, if you feel you're okay with it, to conclude, we can do so.
Happy to. Thank you so much for assisting in the organization of this. It's been really, really great. I really appreciate your help.
Yeah, it's been fun.
It has. Thank you so much, Fatima.
Okay, so thank you everybody for being here today. We do appreciate your participation and attendance, and we'd like to say have a great week ahead, and bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.